Thanks, everybody. Welcome to Build. I'm your host, Ricky Camilleri. Our next guest first turned her camera on her hearing-impaired parents in the 2007 award-winning documentary, Here and Now. Now, Irene Taylor Brodsky follows her deaf son as he discovers the beauty of music, as well as her parents once again as they grow older in the beautiful new film, Moonlight Sonata, Deafness in Three Movements. Let's take a look.
When my son was born, he could hear. When he turned 4,
this is 2,000 hertz, 80, 90, 100.
The audible world closed shut.
Mommy, Daddy, yeah.
I can hear, but my parents are deaf too.
I appreciate you letting me film you.
Of course.
Why are you getting a cochlear implant?
That's because I heard.
Okay, I'm gonna turn it on.
The world of sound came at him. He was getting music back too.
I just started to bed.
And he wanted to learn this. Beethoven wrote the Moonlight Sonata when he was going deaf. Jonas was discovering, but Dad was becoming lost.
What's going on?
It has something to do with my mind.
Right there.
I'm just not comfortable with you driving the kids.
But everybody will say, and I'm gonna drive the kid.
I messed up.
Some people call deafness a mistake.
When I play without my implants, I just feel really joyful and I can just let my mind wander.
You know what Papa said to me today?
He thought his life was better because he was deaf.
His deafness gave him the ability to hear his own voice.
If deafness is a mutation, then maybe our mistakes become our music.
Did it sound good?
It's beautiful.
Everybody, please welcome Irene Taylor Brodsky, director of Moonlight Sonata, Deafness in Three Movements.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for being here, and thank you so much for making this incredibly brave, personal, beautiful movie. The trailer alone gives me the chills and reminds me of the moments in the film that I got shook up and cried. You are an incredible documenter of the personal. You have some sort of ability to be within while at the same time removed, which allows you to tell the story. We were slightly talking about this in the green room, and I do want to get more into what the movie's about and everything that takes place within it, but I am curious how fearful you are of that removal at times and how you strike that balance between staying at arm's length so you can tell the story and think about it as a story, and also maintain being a daughter, a mother.
Well, I think unlike what we're doing right now, which is live, the thing that makes me feel less fearful is that just shoot now and think about it later.
Right.
So a lot of my approach when I made a film 12 years ago about my parents and then filming my family now is I just try to always be there and have the camera rolling. And sometimes that's my iPhone because there's just something happening in front of me. Sometimes it's borrowing someone else's footage that happened to be there and it doesn't look very good, but it was there at the right moment, at the right time, and it's one of those punctuation marks in the narrative that you really need. So I just always am of the mind, let's just shoot this and we'll decide how to actually tell the story later once we get to the edit room.
Do you find it, I mean, people who are creating their own stories and writing a script have a hard time removing certain ideas or making things clear because to them it's clear And to a reader or an audience, it's not. Do you find yourself having trouble like that as well? Because you have lived it. It's hard to recognize whether or not something makes sense or is perfectly clear or has the emotional impact that you think it does.
Sure, sure. And that's where good partners really come into play. Although I am technically the director of the film and I edited the film with one other person and I have a producer, it was really a team effort. My co-editor and my producer were with me in the edit room a lot. And they're the ones who would especially kind of put me in check the morning after I worked till 3 in the morning and edited a scene that I had fallen in love with. And then the next morning, they tell me, well, that's kind of overdoing it, or it's too saccharine. Or conversely, they might say, why don't you like this? This is amazing. So we'll have that kind of dialogue. I think another thing, though, about working in the realm of nonfiction, it's kind of like you walk into a convenience store on the beach in Mexico and you're only going to be able to get what you can get, as opposed to walking into a big Bed Bath & Beyond and you have so many choices. I think when you're a screenwriter or you're writing fiction, anything is possible. To me, that is so daunting. As a nonfiction filmmaker, I have to work with what I get. And so, of course, you're always trying to get more, meaning you're trying to have as many tools in your toolbox, as much food for your narrative. So you really have to plan well. You have to have the camera ready to roll. You have to have the lights on the piano ready to go. But at the same time, you're really you're reined in by just what your footage tells you. So I think in a way, the truth is I don't know how to do it anyway else. I'm not a fiction filmmaker, but I'm sort of thankful for that.
When you're making a documentary about other people, right? Not necessarily your family. Say you're making a documentary about a court case of some kind. You sort of have an idea what your scenes are, in the sense like, my protagonist, the prosecutor of this case, is going to be meeting with somebody here. I better go film that. But when it's your family, oftentimes, I think of my family and my life, a scene bursts out of nothing. Right. Suddenly we're in a fight. Suddenly we're crying. Suddenly something, is happening between the two of us. How do you make sure that those moments are captured? And have you ever found yourself being like, I'm not going to take out my camera right now because that would sort of remove us from what has just sort of naturally occurred between the two of us?
In this film, there were a few moments where I just put the camera away, and they were particularly if my son said, I don't want you to, Mom, I'm just sick of this. And I'd already filmed him, practicing for the 36th time, in a month. And so I would do that. And sometimes, you just run the risk. That might be the moment that he has his little opus or his big opus. You never know. But I think you're constantly balancing, just ethical and human concerns with sort of the commercial drive to make a powerful narrative. A very wise editor who's based here in New York said to me just this past year, Irene, the key to making a good memoir as an editor, because I did, edit the film as well, is to make your family is to make your audience feel that your family is their family. In other words, you're trying to not just make your family feel universal, but include those little moments that we all recognize, like, oh my God, I thought this was just another lunch in the kitchen with my daughter and suddenly it's turned into this. Or why did my mom just flip out? That totally blindsided me. Or why do I suddenly feel this profound love for my child or for my father or for my friend, whatever it may be. And I think that if you can be there in those moments and keep them in the film and not sort of truncate the film and edit them out, and you leave in, I call them messy moments. I think anyone who lives in a family in this room, we live through messiness. It's probably the messiest part of our lives, right, is our family. So I think if you can force yourself to include those moments, and I say force yourself because it's tempting to want to be only putting the pretty parts of the picture in, or the best shots, or the moments that, someone looks the best. Those may not really be the narrative moments that really pull your story out and make it relatable to an audience.
Well, I think of the moment in the film, which we see a brief glimpse of in the trailer, which is just a heartbreaking moment where when you inform your father that he can no longer drive his grandchildren anymore because you just don't think it's safe. And what is so powerful about that moment isn't necessarily what he says, it's the sort of length of time with which we watch this register on his face. You know, you're not just getting to the point of the moment and the scene, we're actually watching him take this in and really think about it, and we're sitting with him, which is kind of, I feel like maybe what you're saying to some degree, that we're sitting with people as they register and as they feel these things.
And as I was registering it. So what happened in that particular scene, my father was developing dementia, and it was just this sliding scale of every day. I was like, oh, when is that day when I can no longer tell Dad he can pick up the kids from school? Because he would pick up my kids every day from school. Huge help to me. And so I learned one day that he got lost coming home from school. And so I sent a text over to my parents. I said, I think tomorrow we'll just start working out, taking home the kids. And my father texted me back, but why? What's going on? Why are you, why? Irene, you need help. You're so busy. Let me help you. And I said, Dad, I'm sorry. My mother texted me 10 minutes later, your father really wants to talk to you about this. Can we come over? I said, yes, you can come over. And then 30 seconds later, it registered. They came to my studio. I said, Mom, when you get here, I'm going to have the camera out. Is that okay? And she said, Dad says that's fine. So when they walked in the door, it's not in the movie, but when they walked in the door, I filmed them walking in the door. I didn't have the right lens on. I didn't have the right microphones on them, but they arrived in 5 minutes. And so I literally am holding the camera like this. I'm practically in tears telling him this as I see how upset he is at me saying, sorry, we got to stop this nice routine we've been in for 3 years or whatever. And so I'm telling him, and I'm also going through a process. But again, back to what I said earlier.
So is your mother as well.
So is my mother. And my mother is crying, and my father is just perplexed, but also accepting. By the end of the conversation, he's accepting about it. And, you know, at this point, we don't really know what's wrong with Paul. We don't really know. We just know that he's confused. And so, you know, again, another family moment when something on your radar tells you something's different, something's off, but your doctor hasn't given you a diagnosis, or you haven't failed that class yet. You just, you know, those feelings we have before they actually get quantified. And I think that was one of those moments. And again, even if you've never dealt with a loved one with Alzheimer's, we all know what those moments are like, where you feel like, oh, this feeling of dread, but it hasn't been named yet, you know.
And it's a dread that he has as well.
It is. And, you know, my father wasn't initially going to be a huge part of this film. He's the deaf grandfather of my deaf young protagonist, and they're very close. And it made sense. But, you know, what my father started to go through, I thought about it, and I thought, you know, 150 years before my father was born, Beethoven was experiencing a similar kind of loss. And Beethoven's sort of that third character in this film. Beethoven wrote the Moonlight Sonata as he was starting to lose his hearing. He didn't understand why. It wasn't always in his grasp. There was nothing he could do about it. And some days he could hear just fine, and then the next day he wouldn't be able to hear hardly at all. Well, that's kind of how dementia is. Some days you're clear-headed, the next day you can't recognize people. So I thought, shoot now, figure it out later. So I just was shooting my father, and then eventually I was shooting my father as much as I was shooting my son. And in the end, it was really only in the editing phase that we realized that Paul was sort of the linchpin between Beethoven, who wrote the Moonlight Sonata in 1801, and Jonas, my son, who was born in the 21st century. And then there was my father, another deaf man, but lived right in the middle of all that. And so what was that like? And so that's where the film gets a little bit into the deaf experience.
So I'm fascinated because we've mostly been talking about your father right now, but as you said, your son Jonas is the protagonist of the film. But when did you realize that there was a film to be made around him? Because as a viewer of the film, to me, the film doesn't really start to coalesce until Paul gets involved, and then the sort of story starts to take shape. But from talking to you right now, it sounds like you had a story in mind prior to Paul even getting involved.
So I was shooting with Jonas for 3 or 4 months before anything even seemed wrong with Paul. So the impetus to film with Jonas was that he announced probably in the early summer that he just said, Mom, I want to learn this piece. It's the Moonlight Sonata, you know, the one Grandpa plays all the time. His other grandfather has been playing this piece since he was a kid. And so he grew up hearing it, and he really fell in love with it. Well, his teacher said, "Oh, Jonas, that's way too hard. You've only been playing 5 years. You can't play this Beethoven piece." And he just started learning it anyway. He just printed out the sheet music from, the internet, and he just started teaching it to himself. Well, I try to sit with my kids when they play. I love listening to them, but also I just sat there and I started to look up things about this song or this piece of music. And I realized that Beethoven had written it during this watershed period of his life. Many of us know that Beethoven was a deaf composer, but he wasn't deaf his whole life, of course. He became deaf. And so he was in this suicidal period. And so when I realized that this song was sort of his rising out of the ashes piece of music, it's so melancholic, but it's also so hopeful and so emotional. I thought, wow, what are the chances? My son also lost his hearing, and my son doesn't even know Beethoven was deaf. Like, he didn't understand that. He was 11. He'd been playing piano for 5 years, but he didn't really know anything about Beethoven. So it was this cosmic coincidence. It was also very poignant and meaningful. But I will admit, it wasn't until I talked to my mentor and dear friend, Sheila Nevins, who used to run the HBO documentary films unit and now is with MTV. She just asked me how my family was doing one day. Right. And I told her, go figure. My son's learning this piece that Beethoven wrote while he was going deaf. So at the end of a 2-hour meeting, she said, by the way, when are we going to start this movie? I think we should call it Moonlight Sonata. So I must give her credit, because she was the one who said...
Sheila Nevins,
I know. Well, she was the one who noticed it.
Legend for a reason, right?
Yeah, and she named it. She named it. It was, again, back to this idea, like, you have this feeling like, oh, this is a really interesting idea or something, but until it gets quantified or named, you almost don't take it seriously enough, especially when it's right in front of you, like your family.
And so much of the film, it's about Jonas learning to play piano, but it's also about him learning his own relationship to his deafness, right? And I found that to be so powerful, this idea of what it means for him to turn his implants on or off and exist within those different spaces. What has it been like for you as a mother to watch him develop this relationship? Because we just assume, a hearing impaired person gets cochlear implants, amazing, they can hear now, and that's all that there is to it. Mm-hmm. But it's so much more complex and nuanced, which I had never seen depicted on screen before.
Mm-hmm. Well, somewhere in this process of filming him, particularly when he started to take off his implants and play more. Once he had memorized the piece, he would play the piece sometimes with his implants off so that he wouldn't hear his own mistakes. He just wanted to feel the music and he wanted to feel the rhythm of it. Then it really got me to thinking, well, how did Beethoven write while deaf? And, we have this kind of, for those of us who know anything about Beethoven, I didn't really much, but the narrative around Beethoven's heroic life is that he created the music he did, the Fifth Symphony, the Ninth Symphony, his Eroica Symphony. He created all of these things in spite of the fact that he was deaf. Well, what if someone said to you, no, he created them because he was deaf. It's actually his deafness that made him write the Ninth Symphony the way he heard it in his mind, that made him have that emotion that went into the Moonlight Sonata. And I realized, that can be said of so many things. We say, well, in spite of the fact that that person battled drug addiction, or in spite of the fact that that person had bipolar disorder, or in spite of the fact that their mother died or their father hit them when he was young, we think of all these things as bad things. And they are, of course, terrible things that we suffer from. But they can make us better artists. They can make us better people. And in the case of deafness, it just shut Beethoven out to the popular music of the time, to criticism, to hearing his own mistakes, quite literally. And he could just sort of hear this dreamy idea of what he thought that these 14 instruments all together, rising and crescendoing all together, would sound like. And it's amazing that he could do that with his deafness. But I think we need to give some credit to the deafness, is my point. And I think that's what I saw with Jonas.
That's what you saw when you saw him developing his relationship to his deafness.
I did, and I think that as a mother, I'd be lying if I said it didn't give me some comfort. That I saw my son finding a value in that thing that people perceive as deficient in him. It's easy, I say in the trailer, some people call deafness a mistake. It's actually a real theme in the film. We talk about, what is a mistake? When you play the wrong note, or when you play it not the way the composer wanted you to, or is a mistake, I would argue, is not giving something your all, not giving it your own mark. That's what a mistake is in a way. But if you're true to who you are and you play it the way you hear it, that's lovely. That's beautiful, you know, and I think that's what he learned. And I'll tell you an amazing anecdote that happened when we were captioning the film. We often show this film with full open captions so that deaf people can experience it. We did 3 rounds of this, and at the end of the 3rd round, we had to do it again and again. A deaf person said, Irene, I think you've done a pretty good job with the captions, but there's one really important thing missing in your captioning of this film. And I said, what? Did Jonas play it beautifully? What did it sound like? As a deaf person, how do I know? The whole film, he's working towards playing it better, playing it more dynamically. You need to tell your deaf audience, did he do a good job or not? And sort of in our thumbs up, thumbs down world we live in now, quantifying what's good and less good or bad, that was a real challenge for me. Like, so I really think that by that point in the film, hopefully as an audience member, you're going to make your own summary judgment. But if you can't hear, you know, you give someone a guidepost.
Yeah, I don't know. I get that question, but to me that is not the point. By the end of the film, he plays it in front of people. He's a child. He doesn't have to be a Beethoven prodigy, you know?
Which he is not.
That's not essential to the story. What's essential to the story is something within the voiceover of him talking about how he enjoys, and excuse me for paraphrasing, I'm going to butcher, and I apologize, but I thought it was so beautiful. He enjoys turning it off with the knowledge that he can come back to it being on, and how that has given him almost a superpower. He doesn't say this, that other people who are not deaf don't have. Right? They can exist within that world.
Well, he has a choice that most of us, I'm going to guess none of us in this room have, which is I can hear or not hear. But again, it is important to him that he can hear. So I think he can enjoy the deafness knowing that he can go back to the hearing.
Yeah. What did your parents and Jonas think of the film when you first screened it for them?
So they were fine with it. I mean,
it's tough.
Yeah, Jonas is I pull him around the country occasionally to go to a Q&A or go to a screening, but he's not clamoring to like get up on a soapbox and tell his life story. He's 13 now. He just kind of takes it in stride. I will say he was a very cooperative film character. As a 13-year-old now, I'm not sure he would have been as cooperative. He's a lot more interested in his friends and his peer group. At 11, he was still kind of in the fold of his mother and father, and he was very, he just would kind of go along. Oh, Mom, you want to make a film? You want to film me? Okay. Some days he wouldn't want to have the camera on, but he was pretty cooperative.
Now he's 13, right?
Now he's 13. Now he's 13, but he's not embarrassed of the film. But he also doesn't brag about it. Like plenty of people at school don't even know the film has happened for him. My parents have been down this road before and actually really got quite a lot of attention 12 years ago when I made this film, and it was really just about them. But I think for my mother, who is, I think you could call a survivor of Alzheimer's, she's living with a loved one with Alzheimer's, the film has been very affirming to her. And so it is nice in that way that she can see this film, and it's a testament to who my father was. We see him as he's going down this path, but you see him, he still has a full life at the beginning of the film. And so it sort of memorializes that memory for her.
I mean, I think I don't want to say heartbreaking aspect of the film is that no matter how far he slides within the film, he still contains a vast amount of love in his eyes that is at times like almost hard to take as you see him sort of not be able to remember something, or not be able to figure out how to take an exit on a highway anymore. And I imagine you still have that as he continues to slide, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, he's not as autonomous, of course, as he could be, but.
And your mother's incredibly strong and in the film.
My mother, I'd like you to know, was an auctioneer at a large conference in Seattle last weekend, and she dressed in a Playboy bunny costume. She's 80. She was wearing bright red glasses. She had her hair in ponytail. She was wearing bunny ears, fishnet stockings, metallic wrestling shoes. I mean, she's pretty cool.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. We have time for a couple questions from the audience. Who has a question?
Hi, I love the animations in the trailer, and I loved when HBO did that with their Kurt Cobain documentary, and I was wondering what inspired the decision to incorporate some drawings or visualizations like that.
Well, I love that you are making any comparisons. I love that Kurt Cobain film, too. We live in Portland, Oregon, me and my crew, and we have a huge animation community there. So basically what I did was I found an animator who basically would be the person to bring images to life, and then I found an illustrator who does work with very bright colors and Mylar, and I sort of forced a marriage between the two of them. And those don't always work. But we really needed to include animation, in my mind at least, because we were trying to make a 19th century character a real character in our film. But we'd seen so many cheesy movies and TV movies about Beethoven. We didn't want to try to personify him too directly. So I felt that using animation that was somewhat literal, but mostly just more dreamy, would be a way that we could depict him as a character. So really the animation was sort of a way to create Beethoven as a character.
Right. To create a character that also wasn't defined by period costume or ideas of the period as well, sort of abstract character.
Yeah, I mean, we did have him like wear a little, Prince style high neck, cravat, which would have been, my illustrator. He definitely reverted to a lot of historical drawings of composers in the late 1800s, early 1900s. But yeah, we were trying. Beethoven is also iconically known for his hair. Like crazy hair, because his hair is, he's moving all the time. So we always made sure he had like a coif, whatever. He may not have a face, but he's also represented as a bird. His creative mind is represented as marbles or planets, or however you want to interpret that, swirling and twirling through space. So we really tried not to be too literal and put you in a little bit of a dream state before bringing you back to the literal everyday life of just an present-day American family.
I think we have time for one more question.
Hello. First, I'd like to say I can't wait to watch the film. It looks amazing, and it actually kind of related to me. My mom is deaf in one ear and half deaf in the other. So growing up, I'm also a musician, so it was kind of hard for me to get that she couldn't hear certain things that I'm playing.
Yeah.
And it took me a while to actually develop like the positive thought about deafness. And I was wondering, when did you develop that positive relationship with deafness as your son did?
That's a great question. Growing up with a deaf parent, similarly, a lot of it does seem like a burden. And I definitely witnessed things as a child that just emasculated my parents and made my father miss opportunities in life and my mother miss opportunities. And that was hard. So I think that started to turn around probably in my young adulthood, in my teens, in my early 20s, when I realized that the friends who were sticking by me in life were the friends who always got along with my parents. Now, isn't that interesting? Because I had friends who were like kind of afraid of my parents, and they'd be like, "Yeah, hi, Mrs. Taylor, yeah," and they would like skulk away. Well, those weren't the friends who lasted. The friends in my life to this day, who are really the friends who I click with, are my friends who my parents always liked and liked my parents. So early on, I found them to be a barometer for sort of quality people. And then, of course, when I made my film about them, I was talking to you about this in the green room, I sort of looked at them and thought, when I looked at them in a finished film on a screen, I thought to myself, wow, their deafness has made their love story the love story it is. Their deafness has made their personality what it is. And I'm grateful for that. So, but definitely as a younger kid up through early high school, I did not like having deaf parents. Yeah.
I love the film, Irene. Congratulations.
Thank you so much.
It premieres the 13th, which is, is that this Friday?
This Friday here in New York.
This Friday here in New York, and then it'll be on HBO, right, as well?
In December.
In December,
yes, but
right.
we have a nationwide release
Amazing.
in the middle of all of that. So in the next couple of months, MoonlightSonataDoc.com is our website, and we have all of our screening cities. We're playing everywhere from New York and LA to Anchorage, Alaska, and Columbus, Ohio, but we're going to Denver and, big city USA and small cities. So please check it out.
Absolutely. Everybody give Irene a huge round of applause for being here.